Hello, test, hello.
Okay.
Okay.
نحتاج من عندك.
Yeah. So I have that going.
خليني بس.
Okay.
ما في فيديو هنا, which I think is.
No, that's fine. I just want to know how I change the slides.
Oh, slides, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So here, okay. Okay, there's just still one brother praying in the adjacent room, so as soon as he's finished, I'll allow the sisters to move over into that space and we'll get started. So just a minute or so here. Okay. As long as the slides are working, that's more important.
Yeah.
Okay. So can you get me back to the slides?
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so sisters, you can move into the adjacent room and then we'll get started. We're good? Yeah.
I cannot move my car. This car is too close. This car. Can you remove the car?
There is a white Honda RV 851K. Brother can't move the car. White Honda. RV.
Yeah. Okay. Brother Mustafa, can we get started? Can the sisters move in? And I'd like to begin. It's getting quite late. Okay, Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. First of all, I would like to apologize for not being able to host last week. I had just come back from 3 days of camp with a bunch of grade 7 boys. As you can imagine, that is exactly as tiring as it sounds. So I thought I would be up for it. I certainly was not. everyone is all the better for it. I can assure you of that. If you remember, if your memories allow you to go back far enough, the last session that we had, we focused on the rise of the secular branch of the Palestinian resistance movements. So that was the rise of the PLO, of Fatah, of their work in Jordan and the Jordanian camps, of the events of southern Lebanon, and eventually their displacement from southern Lebanon into Tunisia, and their pursuit of more diplomatic approaches to the solution or the situation of the Palestinians. Now, I mentioned from the onset that there are two stories here, two stories of resistance, and so today we are going to be focusing on the emergence of Islamic resistance. It's already quite late. I'm going to do my best to finish at kind of a reasonable time, and if we have to do another session or two, we will. But I don't want to keep anyone here longer than necessary. So we have to begin really at the beginning to understand why there are different streams of Palestinian resistance in the first place. And from before the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the people of the Ottoman East, the intellectuals of the Ottoman East, were already struggling with questions of diversity. The Ottoman Empire was the most diverse empire until the rise of America. There really wasn't anything like it. You had every religion that you could imagine. You had dozens of languages being spoken across an enormous region. The Ottoman Empire truly was the successor state to Rome. Okay? Geographically, as well as in its scope and its diversity, it truly was the successor state to Rome. And as the Ottoman Empire began to collapse, important questions started to arise. As we started nearing the end of the Ottoman era, important questions started to arise. And one of those questions are, and these two questions really are related, who are we? That is, the inhabitants of the Ottoman Mashriq, who are these people? Are we primarily Arabs, or are we Muslims? And to the people sitting in this room, because this is a masjid, the answer is presumably going to be very straightforward. You'd say, well, we are Muslims, of course. The first thing that I need to mention here is that, and I mentioned this last week as well, the pan-Arabist movement and the pan-Islamic movement, these were really two sides of the same coin originally. In fact, they were the same people, the same intellectuals who were behind one movement were the same people that were behind the other. Now, the reason why these questions were so complicated and they were not straightforward is because of this. The successors to the Ottoman Empire in places like Iraq, in Syria, in Palestine, they wanted to maintain the diversity that the Ottoman Empire had. If you have no diversity, you don't need to deal with any of these problems. I will demonstrate this, I promise. They wanted to maintain the diversity of the Ottoman Empire. They believed that the diversity that they had was a strength, not a weakness. So, if you say, we, us, we are Muslims, this is, of course, something that most of the people here would certainly agree with. But when you say that, what you insist then is that the Christian and Jewish neighbor that you have, they are a kind of other. Okay? If the us are the Muslims, then the Christian and the Jew is the them. So a workaround to this was, well, then the us are the Arab. And in fact, especially in the early 20th century, there really was no conceptualization of the Arab that was outside of Islam. It didn't really seem like a secular idea. So you say, okay, the us is the Arab. The Arab is more inclusive. It includes the Christians and the Jews. Okay, so problem solved, right? Except then the them becomes the Kurd, the Turkmen, the Amazigh, and all of the non-Arab minorities that we have. So I start here because I need you to understand that in the early 20th century, there was this tension about who we are and what role Islam should play in our future. And in the perspective of this man, we are certainly Muslims. And not only that, but our whole calamity, the calamity of the Muslim world, revolves around the fact that we have allowed Islam to become a smaller and smaller place in our lives, and we need to revive our knowledge and our appreciation for Islam and our Islamic identity in order to reclaim our past glories. And I am speaking about Hassan al-Banna. So Hassan al-Banna, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time here because I have so many things I need to get through. But Hassan al-Banna was the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And he was very much impacted by the sheer scale and power of British colonialism in Egypt. Okay? Now, it is only really in the 1950s in Egypt that you have a serious schism, a serious separation between Arabism and Islamism as ideologies. Okay? I was going to spend more time here. I'm not going to because I need to move on. But the important thing for today's conversation is that there were at least two people. Is there something wrong with the slides? Is that all good? Okay. There were at least two people who I'll be focusing on today, who were heavily impacted by the work of Hassan al-Banna, by the propagation of al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin, of the Muslim Brotherhood, and by their general thinking surrounding the idea that we need to engage in a mass education project of the Muslims in order to get ourselves out of the hole that we are in. One of them was born in 1936. And he was born in the city of Asqalan, outside of Gaza. And at 12 years old, as the Nakba unfolded, he and his family found themselves as refugees inside of Gaza. And as a child, playing with his friends, he was wrestling with one of his childhood friends, ended up falling on his head, leaving him as a cripple for the rest of his life. He showed great aptitude for scholarship at a very early age, and much like Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam before him, who actually died the year before he was born, he decided to attend Al-Azhar. And in his time in Egypt, he became, as I said moments ago, enamored with the ideas and the general project of Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood. And I'm speaking about a man known as Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. Now, the other major figure who I will speak about in not nearly the amount of detail that I hope to speak about, I'm going to have to be brief, was from the city or the village of Yibna, just outside of Gaza. He too became a refugee the year after his birth. He was born in 1947. And in 1956, he watched as Israeli soldiers stormed into, as part of their bigger war against Egypt at that time, as they stormed into Gaza, gathered the men around a school in Khan Yunis and killed them in point-blank range. And one of the people killed that day, when he was just about 8 years old, was his uncle. And he watched this happen right in front of him. And that was a man who grew up to become a doctor, a student activist, and a very shrewd political figure, and his name was Abdul Aziz al-Rantisi. And these two people, through their separate trajectories, but through their involvement in Islamic politics, became really the backbone for an Islamic revival movement in Gaza in particular. Not just in all of Palestine, although remember at this time, if you can, if your memory allows you to go back far enough, 2 weeks ago, remember that at this time, at least after 1967, it became suddenly much easier for Palestinians to travel around into the West Bank, into places that they hadn't been able to travel before. But as far as their core base of operations were concerned, Gaza was really the place where they spent most of their energy developing an Islamic consciousness and Islamic revivalist movement. Now, as a general observation, throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, in Palestine, these Islamic movements that were popping up, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood, were quietist in nature. And what I mean by that is they were political. It's not that they were scared or shy to speak about politics, but they were certainly non-violent. They believed, and it actually makes sense when you think about what was happening in their society at that time. The whole focus of the Muslim world had been on the armies of Jamal Abdel Nasser and whoever to come and clean up the mess that had been made by the arrival of Zionism, by the British imperial project, French imperialism, and so on. So, for at least 2.5 decades, their Islamic project is primarily a social project. And there are a few major events that change the entire region. One is the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And the reason that this was so significant is because the regime of the Shah was, and it's hard to imagine because we live in the present, right? The regime of the Shah was one of the most balanced, stable, deeply entrenched, ironclad authoritarian regimes of the Middle East. And the overturning of the Shah's, the overthrow of the Shah and the emergence of what came to be was something so unimaginable just a few years before that. And just like the Algerian Revolution had inspired the secular Palestinian nationalist movements, the overthrow of the Shah came to show that Islamic movements can do this. This is possible. This is not theoretics. Whether it was a Shia movement or not is actually entirely besides the point. The core point being that this is possible. The other major development, of course, was both, and these happened just right around the same time, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the assassination of Anwar Sadat, the Egyptian president. On the one hand, the assassination of Anwar Sadat clamped down on Islamic movements, but the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan gave all these Islamic movements somewhere to go, somewhere to redirect their energy. That's not our story today. The reason why I bring those things up is because within the Muslim Brotherhood, there were voices who were starting to say that we need to confront Israel and the Zionist movement now. This cannot wait for another generation. This confrontation needs to happen immediately. The debate unfolded like this. The core top brass of the Muslim Brotherhood, both inside Palestine and in Egypt, believed that the priority should be to unite the Muslim world, and then we can confront Zionism. Some dissenting voices were starting to say, if you do not confront Zionism now, you are never going to unite the Muslim world. And so, a small branch from within the Muslim Brotherhood broke off, and they decided to create another movement, a splinter movement, that would be committed to armed resistance against the Zionist movement. And that was led by a man named Fathi Shiqaqi. And he formed an organization called Islamic Jihad. Now this organization still exists, and what's interesting here is that for Sheikh Ahmed Yassin and for Abdul Aziz al-Rantisi, they began to see, and they were also internally, they were having these debates. Is it the right time for armed resistance? But they began to see that if they and whatever organization they have created, if it does not confront the Zionist project, it is going to wither into obscurity and irrelevance. Sooner or later, organizations like this new organization, Islamic Jihad, are going to pop up, and they are going to take the reins, and we are going to feel as though we should have been there with them. We should have been part of that. Now, while all of these conversations are taking place, another huge, organic, spontaneous event erupts, this time inside Palestine, and that is the First Intifada. The First Intifada really sparked off, I'm only listing for you the straw that broke the camel's back. The First Intifada had been building up for a long time, but the tension really erupted when a Jewish truck driver ran over a group of Palestinians, and then the whole country went up in flames. Everywhere in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, all over the place, youth went into the streets throwing stones at Israeli soldiers, boycotts, national committees, strike committees were set up all over the place, very much reminiscent of what happened in the 1936 revolt. Very much reminiscent of that. Later, that happened in 1987. Later in that year, in I believe November of 1987, Abdul Aziz al-Rantisi, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, and about 4 or 5 others gathered in a grungy basement in Gaza, and they wrote up a document to basically say, this is going to be the charter of our new movement, and we are going to be committed to the project of armed resistance against the Zionist movement. And they tested out a few different names for a while, different Islamic themed names, and they ended up resting on Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, the acronym of which comes together to form the word Hamas, which also means zeal or enthusiasm in Arabic. And the opening line of that charter, as a total break from the general mode of operations of the Muslim Brotherhood at that time, the opening line of the charter was actually a quote from Hassan al-Banna, where he says, Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it has obliterated others before it. So it really set the tone for what this organization is going to be about. Now, this whole series is a history of Palestinian resistance. And what we are seeing here in the 1980s was, on the one hand, the emergence of Islam as the primary motivator and animator of Palestinian resistance, and also I guess we'll call it like the solidification or the crystallization of resistance being a core part of Palestinian identity. These two things are really coming together in the 1980s. A short while after the creation of this movement, they decide that they need to separate their militant activities from their social activities. And so, in naming their armed wing, they decide on a name that will give their movement, despite it being relatively new, it will give their movement a kind of pedigree within the Palestinian history of Islamic resistance. They call their armed wing the Izzuddin al-Qassam Brigades. I said in the lecture on Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam, I quoted him saying that his voice will echo through the countryside. And this is the greatest possible evidence of that. Now, something I have to address here immediately is the, let's call it a myth, I think that's safe to say, the myth that Israel invented Hamas. So, I'm sorry, Mehdi Hassan, but Israel did not invent Hamas. The reality is that Israel saw the emergence of Islamic movements very early on and did not crush them. When the Islamic movements began to emerge as social movements, they thought this might be a good counterweight to Fatah and the PLO. And in keeping with their colonial roots, this may play well into our policy of divide and conquer. Let's let them grow and see what happens. Now, if anyone here is thinking, I feel like we've seen that movie before. I feel like we've seen that in other places. It seems that colonial powers seem to like to play with Islam, thinking that it's like a child playing with a lighter. What they don't realize is that it's like a child playing with a lighter next to a propane tank. They think that they can control it, but once it emerges, it becomes something completely different. And so, as soon as Hamas began to engage in armed resistance activities, they immediately realized this is going to be a problem. Right? It did not take the Shin Bet very long to realize that that was not the best strategy. But did they invent Hamas? No. That is idiocy. Now, in the very, very early stages, the militant activity of Hamas took on some very, very basic forms. And I say basic, I was going to use the word primitive, but I don't want to be dismissive, because they were dealing with the tools that they had at their disposal. And their activities very early on involved walking up to Israeli soldiers at point-blank range from zero distance and killing them and taking their guns, which was a level of brazenness that the Israelis were not used to in the 1980s. And the architect of this particular tactic was, by some narrations, the founder of the Qassam brigades, and his name was Anad Aqib. And within a very short span of time, he had wound up orchestrating and personally being involved in the targeted killing of 11 Israeli soldiers. So Israel launched of course, massive manhunt looking for him. He ended up being killed by Israel shortly thereafter and being replaced by Salah Shahad. That is Hamas's targeting of the Israelis. And up until 1994, that was the Qassam Brigade's mode of operation. Target Israeli soldiers at point-blank range. But they had a whole other mode of operation, or they had a whole other focus, I should say, and that was on dealing with the sheer number of collaborators that Israel had managed to implant all over Palestine. And when you're basically running a giant prison, right? when you have subjugated the people who live under your occupation, it becomes easy to generate umara, to generate collaborators. And the central figure tasked with hunting down collaborators was someone who will probably be familiar to anyone who watches the news, and his name is Yahya Sinwar. He ended up being imprisoned for his work in hunting down collaborators. His story will come up next week. It is at this time that, despite the fact that Hamas only targeted Israeli soldiers, despite the fact that up until 1994-ish, 1994, Hamas only targeted Israeli soldiers, they were designated by Israel as a terrorist organization, which also gives you the idea, or at least should really instill with you the idea, that there is no kind of resistance that Israel will ever view as non-terrorist. 2 years ago, Israel banned 6 non-governmental organizations. They dealt with prisoners' rights, they dealt with immigration reform and work permits and things like that. I can't remember what all 6 organizations did. All 6 were labeled as terrorist organizations. Their offices closed down. This is the kind of entity that you're dealing with. As part of this crackdown, now that they've been labeled as a terrorist organization, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin is arrested. And from this point, you can begin to see, well, from that point, from the moment that the crackdown begins, Hamas begins to put more responsibility on another branch of its organization, which is its leadership in exile. So now I'm going to take a little bit to talk about the structure of the organization. There is an internal branch of Hamas that is internal inside Gaza and the West Bank, as well as, especially in the early days, more secret members or sympathizers inside Israel proper. There is an external leadership in the neighboring countries, so that is places like Lebanon, previously in Syria, in Jordan, also previously in Jordan, and in Egypt. There is a representation there. And there was also an exiled leadership in the Gulf and abroad. And naturally, given the fact that they live and operate under occupation, there is also a leadership that exists inside the prison systems. And all of these branches form the Shura Council of this organization. So, with the crackdown of the 1980s, the leadership in exile begins to take on more and more prominence because they do not live under Israeli occupation. Now, things kind of trickle along for a couple of years, and then when the organization is about 5 years old, Israel decides to embark on what can only be described as its stupidest policy venture ever. As Hamas is targeting Israeli soldiers, and in a particular instance in 1992, a couple of Israeli soldiers are killed, they decide, that's it. We are going to take the leadership of this organization and we are going to exile them. The thing is, where do you exile a bunch of Islamists from Palestine? Well, you can't send them to Egypt. Egypt doesn't want them. Jordan doesn't want them either. You're not going to send them to America. You're not going to be able to send them to London or Paris or Berlin or something like that. So they exile them to Israeli-occupied southern Lebanon, to a camp called Marj al-Zuhur. And it is in southern Lebanon that the leadership of Hamas meets and corresponds with the leadership of Hezbollah for the first time. Prior to this, there was no communication. Hezbollah as an organization has now existed for 12 or 13 years. And they've had a lot of experience dealing with the Israeli occupation as a resistance movement. About a year later, the Israelis realized this was probably not our best idea, and they reversed their decision to exile them and bring them back to Gaza. And so people like Abdul Aziz al-Rantisi come back to Gaza having learned a ton about what it means to manage an armed resistance movement. You'll hear the term, if you watch the news, you'll hear the term the axis of resistance a lot. And we could say with some level of confidence that to the degree that an axis of resistance exists, it was birthed on the slopes of southern Lebanon in 1992. Now, coming into the early 90s, Hamas has a very distinct mode of operation that was a break from the way that the PLO operated. And in fact, they learned many lessons from the way that the PLO operated in the 90s. The first thing is that up until 1994, Hamas directed all of its attacks only against Israeli soldiers. And their communications of that time made it clear that that was their intention. The second point is really important. All of their operations, all of their activity took place inside Palestine, that is, between the river and the sea. They attacked Israeli soldiers inside 1948 Palestine. They attacked Israeli soldiers in the West Bank. They attacked Israeli soldiers in the Gaza Strip. But they did not attack Israeli soldiers somewhere else. Whether it was in southern Lebanon, whether they are going for training exercises in America or something like that, or they didn't attack Israeli diplomats or anyone in any other place. And they had learned from the lessons of the PLO. They saw what happened to the Palestinian resistance in Jordan in the 1970s. They saw what happened in Lebanon in the 1980s. And one of the principles of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin was that he did not want bad relationships with the neighboring countries. They also made sure to frame each and every attack as a response to something that Israel had done. They also wanted to make sure to emphasize that their resistance could increase in volume and magnitude and could also decrease because they were rational actors. And lastly, they wanted to make it very clear in those early days that they had the right to maintain armed resistance despite how meager and humble their resources are. Now, while all of this is happening, and while Hamas is developing a kind of military doctrine of its own, there is another major thing happening in Palestine, and that is the Oslo Accords. While Hamas is developing its strategy of combating the Zionist occupation, Yasser Arafat and the Palestine Liberation Organization are engaged in what many around the world believe are negotiations that will lead to a final status agreement with the State of Israel. Here's what's really important for everyone here to realize. The Oslo Accords created the mutual recognition between the State of Israel as a sovereign on 78% of the land and the PLO as representatives of Palestine. The Oslo Accords were not a bilateral agreement between the State of Israel and the State of Palestine. The Oslo Accords were an agreement of mutual recognition between the State of Israel and the PLO. And that is a really important difference. Because Yitzhak Rabin, the Prime Minister of Israel, made it very clear that Palestinians would be getting a state minus. So that means they can have like a flag and a national anthem, and they can have like the decorations of a state, but they'll never have sovereignty over their security. We will never allow that to happen. At the same time, the key metric of success for the PLO was not how well can they defend the Palestinians. You think like, what is the key metric of success of the RCMP? Or the Surrey PD that we're going to get in a little while, or the VPD. The key metric of success is how well does it protect the people that it is obliged to protect and serve. If the VPD was measuring its success by how well it protected Americans who are coming from Bellingham or something, you'd say, what? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Your job is to protect us, not everyone else. You could protect them too, but your primary job is to protect us. Well, the key metric of success for the PLO as part of the Oslo Accords was how well they could protect Israel, which is bananas. That's why Edward Said called it the Palestinian Versailles, referring to the Treaty of Versailles that the Germans signed at the end of the First World War. This was a surrender document. And Hamas were keen to make sure it failed. Part of the agreement between Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin was that the PLO in exile would be allowed to return to Palestine, and they did. They came and arrived from Tunis into Palestine, and that gave birth to the Palestinian Authority and all of these wonderful institutions that we know today. In February of 1994, an Israeli settler named Baruch Goldstein walked into Al-Haram al-Ibrahimi, that is the burial place of Ibrahim alayhi salam in the city of Al-Khalil, and he killed dozens of musallin, or worshippers in that masjid. He was eventually beaten to death, I believe with a fire hydrant, if my memory serves me right, at Salat al-Fajr. And after that, Hamas chose to change its tactics entirely. There clearly was an internal debate inside Hamas about whether attacking Israeli soldiers alone was sufficient for their goal of not just alleviating pressure or creating pain for the Israelis, but driving them out entirely, first and foremost from Gaza and the West Bank, and then later from Palestine entirely, because this was Hamas's goal. The problem is that their existing tactics, their attacks from zero distance, were not effective enough. They didn't have an effective enough delivery system. So, one member of the organization revolutionized the delivery system. He thought, what if the person himself could be the delivery system? What if rather than planting an explosive device and walking off, not knowing what happens, what if the person just remains with the explosive device when it goes off? And the architect of this was Yahya Ayyash. And he was known in the lore of Hamas as the engineer. He was the architect of and the founder of, inside Palestine, he was the architect of and the founder of the tactic of martyrdom operations, what they would call in the Western media suicide bombings. Now, I feel like it's important here to state something quite clearly, and that is that this was hotly contested inside Palestinian circles and inside Muslim thought in general. This was not an easy thing. And the idea behind it was, we don't have a ton of options. I'm being like super simplistic here, but I'm trying to cover a lot of material. 40 days after the Baruch Goldstein massacre, the first martyrdom operation happens in the Marj ibn Amr region of Palestine. And just a week after that, another takes place. And now Israel awakens to a new reality. There is a whole different weapon being deployed. And this can be deployed everywhere at any time. And it grips, at the time, this was treated as nothing short of an existential threat for the Zionists. This was terrifying for them. They had never seen something like this. In all likelihood, this is something that Hamas had learned from Hezbollah, because they had used it before. Ayyash himself was assassinated in 1996 via a cell phone bomb. The explosive device was planted there by his cousin. So when we talk about Hamas's obsession with collaborators, the obsession was real because the threat was real. Now after that, that tactic remains as the premier tool of operation for most of the 90s. And of course, Israel responds by destroying the home of the person who is responsible and arresting their family and doing all of these other things. But this is the climate that we find for most of the 1990s at a time where Jordan has now signed a peace agreement with Israel. Arafat has signed a peace agreement with Israel. And the conversation is working toward a two-state solution. The problem is, as we know now, it was a conversation that was meant to lead nowhere. It was a cul-de-sac, it wasn't a highway. And at that time, Israel, for the first time, elects Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister. And he does, if I said that the exile of Hamas was the stupidest thing that Israel had done, this is certainly in the top 10. Out of nowhere, really what seemed like out of nowhere, there's this assassination attempt in broad daylight in Amman, in a place where they had just signed a peace agreement, to kill a guy nobody had ever heard of. People knew, like on the news, people knew Abdulaziz al-Rantisi. They knew Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. They knew Salah al-Shahada. But in broad daylight, the Israeli Mossad tried to kill and failed to kill a man named Khalid Mash'al. And suddenly everyone in the world wanted to know, who is Khalid Mash'al? Khalid Mash'al was the leader of Hamas in exile. And one of the reasons why he was so high on Israel's kill list is because from day one, from the moment that Hamas came into inception, Khalid Mash'al, through his connections in Kuwait and through his connections in the Gulf, has been instrumental in playing the role of financier. Sheikh Ahmed Yassin was the spiritual head. Abdulaziz al-Rantisi was the most public face, the firebrand, and a strong political figure. But Khalid Mash'al was the money guy. Well, the attempt fails. In fact, the assassins were using Canadian passports. And recently, just before that, the Toronto Blue Jays had won the World Series. And so when the Canadian ambassador went to see these two assassins, he said, "Can you sing the Canadian national anthem?" "No." "Okay, do you know who just won the World Series?" "No." So he went back and told the Jordanians, "These guys are not Canadians. Like, they're something else." And then they discovered that they were spies. In order to, now Khalid Mash'al still lay in hospital dying when these two Mossad agents were arrested. And King Hussein threatened to have them executed. Was he really going to execute them? I don't know. But he threatened to have them executed if they did not give up the antidote to save Khalid Mash'al's life. So Israel not only ended up giving up the antidote, but in order to make things good with Jordan, and obviously as a request from Hamas, they ended up freeing from prison Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. Shortly thereafter, the Jordanians kicked Hamas out of Jordan. And the Hamas leadership in Jordan needs to set up shop somewhere else, and they end up moving to Syria. Now, all of this is hopping around quite a bit, because there is a lot that happens. And I'm going to say, if there was 1 year, if I could have only spoken about 1 year in this whole series, it would have been the year 2000. There's a quote that's attributed to Vladimir Lenin. I think that's actually a myth. I'm not sure if it's actually a Lenin quote, but there's a quote that says that there are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen. And the summer of the year 2000, that was a series of weeks where decades happened. The first major event, Israel unilaterally withdraws from southern Lebanon. Southern Lebanon was Israel's Vietnam. From 1982 onward, they had occupied it, and it had been Jahannam for them. They couldn't hold it, they couldn't settle it, they couldn't stabilize it. They embedded their own network of agents and collaborators. And if you want to see the greatest footage you'll ever see in your life, watch the celebrations in southern Lebanon when the Israelis leave. If you want to have an idea, a vision of what Palestine will look like when it's liberated, that gives you like a snapshot. And that was a huge event for everyone involved in Palestinian resistance, because it demonstrated that resistance can drive out the Israelis. A few months later, this faltering peace process climaxes in Camp David II, the final act of the Oslo Accords, wherein Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat meet with the famous womanizer and best friend of Jeffrey Epstein. Also, he was president of the United States, I guess, so that's relevant, Bill Clinton. And they meet in Camp David, and on the claims of Bill Clinton, Arafat was offered the deal of the century, but it included no right of return for Palestinian refugees. And Arafat, with all of his faults, could not accept a deal, however attractive it was, that did not include the right of return for Palestinian refugees. Of course, it didn't include a whole bunch of other things. It didn't include Al-Quds, so that's very significant. But the point is that after that, the oxygen is sucked out of the peace process. Shortly thereafter, this bovine of a human being, Ariel Sharon, ascends to Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, surrounded by armed guards, and another intifada breaks out. All of these things happened weeks apart. And again, you could see that with the emergence of another intifada, the armed resistance factions in Palestine, so shortly after the withdrawal of Israel from southern Lebanon, they believe they can get from Israel what Hezbollah got in southern Lebanon. They can accomplish the same thing. And now, originally, you have waves of martyrdom operations from so many different organizations. Islamic Jihad, the organization founded by Fethi Shiqaqi, they're engaged in these operations. Kataib Shuhada al-Aqsa, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades. It's Hamas who's actually quiet for the first 6 months of the Intifada. And they actually articulate to Israel, we are willing to have a hudna, a peace treaty, not a peace treaty, sorry, a truce, a period of quiet for up to 10 years if you withdraw from Gaza and the West Bank. Israel, of course, refuses this. And the thinking becomes, can the resistance bleed out the Israelis? Can they balance out the terror of the Israeli occupation with their own campaign of horror and terror? For every crying mother in Gaza and in Jenin and Tulkarem, can they have crying mothers in Tel Aviv and Haifa and all of these other places? Can they create a balance? Hamas is coming to Israel and is pulling up a seat at the table. They do not want to do what the PLO are doing and negotiate with them. They want to negotiate with force. The question becomes, how costly can we make the occupation? Ariel Sharon is elected in 2001, in February 2001, and Hamas begins its campaign in March of 2001. And they announced a campaign from May to July of 2001. They announced what they call the 10 Bombers campaign. They said, we've unleashed 10 martyrs all over Palestine. We're not going to tell you where they are. You're just going to find out when the time comes. And as you can imagine, for Israel and for the Zionists, this was terrifying. This is also the time where they introduce a new weapon, which is a rocket that they call the Qassam rocket. And that is introduced in April of 2001 for the first time. All of this accelerates and advances. And then you have what is probably the most seismic event of my entire life, and that is 9/11. And when the events of September 11th unfolded, the Bush administration launched something called the War on Terror. And now the War on Terror in Afghanistan and subsequently Iraq, the language of the War on Terror and the blank check of the War on Terror was adopted by Ariel Sharon and the Israelis. And they were able to tell the Americans, just like you are fighting a war on terror, we are also fighting a war on terror. Forget the decades of occupation, forget all of those things. It's exactly the same. Our war and your war is exactly the same. Not as if either war was just, but in any case, this war on terror allows Israel a level of leverage that they did not have before, a level of impunity that they did not have before, because in the West, it was perceived as fighting the same war that they were now fighting. Now, this next bit is not exactly related to Hamas, and yet it's important for every single person sitting in this room. As part of the crackdown on the war on terror, and as part of the crackdown on Palestinians in general, in 2002, the Americans shut down an organization that was called the Holy Land Foundation. How many of you have heard of the Holy Land Foundation? Wow. So, because this is recorded, I just want the record to show that nobody put their hand up. Before Islamic Relief, before Penny Appeal, before Human Concern International, before any of these, there was the Holy Land Foundation. It was the largest Islamic charity in North America. And it was founded and run primarily by Palestinians. And it was truly a charity organization that had the misfortune of being run by Palestinians. In a book called, I recommend it for anyone here, anyone who's always asking me for books, in a book called Kill Khalid, which is about the assassination attempt on Khalid Mash'al, they also talk about the shutting down of the Holy Land Foundation. And through legal gymnastics, and after a mistrial in a kangaroo court, like I don't know what else to call these things, the Americans end up imprisoning for life, well, for decades, some of the founders of the Holy Land Foundation, and for life, other founders of the Holy Land Foundation, some of whom are still in prison to this very day. If you've ever wondered, why are some Masajid so scared to talk about Palestine? They still remember the Holy Land Foundation. This sent shockwaves throughout North America and Europe among Islamic organizations, because they were really doing charity work. But as part of the war on terror, they lost their jobs and, functionally speaking, their lives. And now you also have, so in addition to having this crackdown on Islamic charities, and in addition to having the crackdown on, a very severe crackdown, of course, on Palestinian life inside Palestine during the Second Intifada, some of the people in this room lived through that crackdown. You also now had a crackdown inside the Arab world. Now suddenly, places like Kuwait, places like Bahrain, places like Saudi Arabia, who may have been more friendly toward Hamas and their fundraising efforts, now in the environment of the war on terror, and seeing that the Bush administration doesn't really have an appetite for any of these things, is starting to say, maybe this isn't the place for you. There are several things that happen as we move into 2002 and 2003. Now I'm going to start rifling off a few points because it is getting quite late. Among them are the Arab Peace Initiative. And it was a push by the Arab states to fully normalize relations with Israel if Israel retreats to the 1967 borders. If Israel gives up Gaza and the West Bank, then you can have peace with the Arab states, and this was led by Saudi Arabia, or authored by Saudi Arabia, and supported by the Arab League. Hamas responded to this while the Arab League was negotiating and putting the final ink on the Arab Peace Initiative. Hamas responded with its biggest ever martyrdom operation. Because for Hamas and for these movements to sign off on 78% of Palestine means that you will never have the moral legitimacy to fight for it even in the future. It is either part of Palestine or it's not. And it is either occupied or it's not. And more importantly, it is either that the Nakba was an injustice that needs to be reversed or not. We are either going to cross our arms and say that the Nakba was morally justified and Israel's existence is morally justified, or we are going to reject that. And so Hamas rejected that with the utmost enthusiasm. This prompted Operation Defensive Shield that saw Israel come in and smash Jenin and other places in a huge operation that was really unprecedented at that time. You also have at this time the emergence of a wall that separates the West Bank from the rest of Palestine. The most successful thing that Israel did at this time, and I'm actually I think I might stop here for tonight. I've thrown a lot at you guys. The most successful thing that Israel did at this time in its effort to combat armed resistance, and this is a legacy we still live with right now, it is colonizing the geography of our minds. We now think of a problem happening in Syria as separate from a problem happening in Palestine. Right? We think of the invasion of Iraq as distinct from the Zionist project or something like that, right? These are different countries. And this is the colonization of the geography of our minds that is a legacy of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. But over the decades, Israel has quite cleverly deployed a different kind of occupation in different parts of Palestine. Ramallah experiences the Israeli occupation different from Ariha. And Ariha experiences the occupation different from Nablus. And Nablus experiences it different from Al-Khalil. And Al-Khalil experiences it different than Tulkarem. And all of them experience it differently than Gaza. And because of that, the suffering of the people in Gaza feels unique and far removed. And the suffering of the people in Nablus feels unique and far removed. And the suffering of the people in Al-Khalil feels unique and far removed. It allows us to say things like the Israeli war on Gaza, the Israeli war on Rafah, the Israeli war on Khan Yunis. If you make the occupation unique in each one of these places, in Al-Khalil, in Hebron, people live with Israeli settlers in their house. I don't mean a house that they moved out of, I mean a house they still live in. They live in one room, there's a settler living in the basement. In Nablus, they don't deal with this. In Nablus, they deal with around-the-clock incursions. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the Israeli comes in and smashes everything. In Al-Quds, they deal with a permit regime you cannot imagine. When somebody from Al-Quds wants to go accomplish anything, they carry around more paperwork than you've ever carried in your life to just try to do something super basic. A friend of mine lives in Al-Quds. So when he wants to go to renew his iqamah, to renew his visa, or he wants to go do anything basic, sometimes a trip that is 900 meters, it takes him 11 hours. These are not exaggerated numbers. This is real life. In Gaza, they live in a concentration camp that is different from all of those other experiences. And that is intentional. And that really has its origins in the Israeli strategy of the early 2000s. In that sense, we can say that they were successful. They have been successful thus far. I had so much more that I wanted to say, but it is getting quite late. So I will continue the rest of this next week, inshallah, and I will try to use that week to bring us up to the present. If I can't, I don't know. I'll talk to the administration and see what we can do. Otherwise, I will open the floor to questions. Any questions, concerns, feedback, or remarks? I know, it was a lot. Yeah. Okay. And if we have any, I'll just keep my phone open. If we have any questions on the sister side, please do let me know. Yeah, you can turn the light on. Yes, sir.
Why was this area beneficial for Israel to do this? And what was the point to do different occupations on different parts of Palestine?
So the brother is asking, why was it important for Israel to create a new feeling of occupation in each part of Palestine? So first of all, I should mention that they also cantonized the West Bank. They set up a series of checkpoints in between Palestinian towns. So here's one reason. To go from Ariha to Nablus, like geographically speaking, it should take you a couple of hours. Functionally speaking, you'll never make it. Like it'll take you, you must have a really good reason to be going there. Okay? And if you never go to a place, it may as well be on Mars. Like if Nablus feels like the end of the earth, right? Then you're not really all that motivated to try to go there. And if you don't go there, you don't ever build connections there. That means you don't marry from any of the sisters there, you don't have any cousins there, you don't do any work there, you don't build any memories there, you don't build any relationships. Okay? So just the sheer number of like checkpoints and things like that will accomplish that goal. But the other thing is that when they experience something, in the same way that look, Pakistan had terrible floods a year and a half ago. Right? Does Vancouver rains a lot. Does Vancouver flood? Abbotsford flooded a few years ago, but it wasn't like Pakistan. So we see something like that. We say, but you know, we donate and we support, but we don't know what it feels like. It feels like something remote and distant and far removed. Yeah? But if there's a shooting in Burnaby, or that's not Allah, if like a masjid is burnt to the ground in Kuala or Burnaby or something like that, you're going to feel like that could have been my masjid, right? That's my community. If the circumstances they're dealing with are foreign and strange and totally unfamiliar to the circumstances you deal with, it will be as though it's a different country. It's a whole different people with their own problems and their own set of circumstances. Does that make sense? And in that regard, people in the West Bank right now are distraught over what's happening in Gaza, but it's not happening to them. And it doesn't feel like it's happening to them. They're experiencing something completely different. Yeah. Great question, though. There is a trend that I've picked up on throughout the last 4 lectures, which is that I answer 2, 3, or 4 questions, and then I get up to put all my things away, and 5 of you come up to me and say, "Brother, I have a question." So if you plan on doing that, please save me the trouble and just ask them now instead of when I'm putting things away. It would help a lot. Yeah, I'll give it 30 seconds. Yes.